Sable had not planned on being humiliated in front of the entire kingdom tonight. But the world rarely consulted her before ruining her life, so here she was, standing barefoot on cold marble in a throne room filled with people who would not remember her name tomorrow. The hall was enormous. Vaulted ceilings carved from pale stone stretched so high the candlelight could not reach them, and the darkness above pressed down like a held breath. Hundreds of wolves filled the gilded rows of seats, dressed in silks and embroidered furs, their laughter sharp and glittering in the firelight. They had come to celebrate. The rite of presentation, the annual ceremony where unmated omegas of noble blood were formally introduced to the Alpha King and his court. Sable was not noble. She was not invited. She was not supposed to be here at all. But hunger made people reckless, and 3 days without food had made Sable desperate enough to slip through a servant's entrance with a stolen cloak over her shoulders and her face hidden beneath a deep hood. The plan had been simple: walk in with the servants carrying the wine trays, steal bread from the banquet table, walk out. The plan had fallen apart roughly 4 minutes ago. A guard had spotted her bare feet beneath the hem of the cloak. No servant went barefoot. He had grabbed her arm and dragged her forward through the crowd, and now she stood at the base of the raised dais where the throne sat, exposed under the blaze of 1,000 candles, with every pair of eyes in the hall locked onto her, including his. King Acastus Valendor sat on the throne like he had been carved from the same pale stone as the pillars around him. He was still, the kind of stillness that made the air feel heavier, the way the forest went quiet when something with teeth was watching. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes, pale amber, almost gold, studied her with the detached curiosity of a man examining something stuck to the bottom of his boot. He was beautiful, the way a blade was beautiful, the kind of face you noticed right before it cut you. "What is this?" His voice was low, unhurried, and it carried through the hall without effort. The guard shoved Sable forward. She stumbled, caught herself, and straightened. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain the entire room could hear it. "A trespasser, Your Majesty," the guard announced. "Found sneaking through the east corridor. Omega. No house markings, no invitation seal." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sable kept her head down, her hood pulled low, her fingers white-knuckled around the edges of her cloak. "An Omega with no house," the king repeated. His tone carried a note of dry amusement that made the court titter. "So, a stray." Laughter, bright and cruel, cascaded through the rows. Sable's face burned beneath the hood, but she said nothing. "Look at me," Acastus said. She did not move. The silence that followed was a living thing. It crawled across the marble floor and wrapped around her throat. The court stopped laughing. Even the candles seemed to hold still. "I said look at me." The amusement was gone now. What replaced it was something flat and absolute, a voice built for commands that no living creature disobeyed. Sable lifted her chin. The hood fell back, and every sound in the throne room died. She felt it happen in stages. The whisper of fabric sliding off her hair, the cool air hitting her face, the sudden, violent silence that slammed through the hall like a door blown open by a storm. She could not understand why they were staring. Why the king had gone rigid on his throne, his knuckles white against the armrest, his amber eyes wide and fixed on her face with an expression she could not name. She could not understand why the scent hit her then, rolling off him in a wave so thick and overwhelming that her knees nearly buckled. Cedar and iron and something ancient and burning, something that reached into her lungs and squeezed. Her wolf, dormant her entire life, silent and small and half-starved, surged forward with a force that nearly knocked her to the floor. The word arrived in her mind like a crack of lightning. Mate. No, that was impossible. She was no one. She was nothing. She was a beggar in stolen rags standing barefoot in a throne room, and the Alpha King was staring at her like the ground had just opened beneath his feet. His jaw clenched. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and desperate, and then it was gone. Buried. Locked away behind a mask of cold authority so fast she almost believed she had imagined it. "Remove her," Acastus said. The words did not waver. "She is trespassing on crown land during a sacred rite. Hold her in the East Tower until I decide what to do with her." The guard seized her arm. Sable did not resist. She was too stunned to fight back, too shaken by the words still ringing through every nerve in her body. Mate. The Alpha King was her mate. And he had just ordered her locked in a tower. The East Tower smelled like damp stone and neglect. Sable sat on a wooden bench bolted to the wall, her bare feet pulled up beneath her, the stolen cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders. Moonlight came through a narrow window slit and laid a thin silver line across the floor. She had been here for hours. No one had come. No food, no water, no explanation. The words still echoed in her skull like a bell that would not stop ringing. Mate. Her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, agitated in a way she had never experienced before, pressing forward, wanting out, wanting to find him. She pushed it down with effort and focused on breathing. This could not be real. Fated bonds were supposed to be rare, sacred, a gift from the old bloodlines. They were for noble wolves, for people with names and titles and houses, not for foundlings. Not for a girl who had been left on the steps of a poorhouse as an infant with nothing but a scrap of linen and no note. She pressed her forehead against her knees and tried to think. He had felt it too. She had seen it in the way his body had locked, the way his eyes had widened before he buried the reaction. He knew what she was to him, and he had sent her here anyway. The lock on the door turned with a heavy clank. Sable's head snapped up. A man entered, tall and lean, with sharp features and the controlled posture of someone accustomed to standing one step behind power. He wore the deep blue of the king's inner circle, and his eyes swept the cell with practiced efficiency before settling on her. "My name is Taryn," he said. "I serve as the king's chancellor." Sable stared at him. "Am I being released?" "No." The word hung in the cold air. Taryn studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then produced a small loaf of bread and a flask of water from inside his coat. He set them on the bench beside her. "Eat," he said. "You look half dead." Sable eyed the bread. Her stomach screamed at her, but pride held her still for 3 full seconds before hunger won. She tore into the loaf, and Taryn watched her eat without comment. "You felt it," he said when she had finished. It was not a question. Sable wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Felt what?" "Do not waste my time," Taryn replied evenly. The entire hall saw what happened. The king's reaction was visible to anyone with functioning eyes. "You are his fated mate." The words, spoken aloud by someone else, hit differently. Harder. More real. "Then why am I in a cell?" Sable asked. Taryn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because the rite of presentation has already selected a bride for the king, Lady Orenna of House Veilcrest. The betrothal was announced 3 weeks ago. The alliance her family provides is critical to the stability of the northern border." Sable blinked. "He is already promised to someone else?" "A political match," Taryn confirmed. "Arranged before you existed in his awareness. The king cannot simply discard a betrothal that holds a border alliance together because a starving Omega wandered into his throne room." The bluntness of it stole the breath from her lungs. "So what happens to me?" Taryn was quiet for a long moment. "That depends entirely on the king," he said, "and the king is currently in a very dangerous mood." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it is worth," he added without looking back, "in 15 years of service, I have never seen him lose his composure. Not once. Not during the Ashenmore Rebellion. Not when his own father died. The door closed. The lock turned. Sable sat alone and tried to process the fact that the most powerful wolf in the realm was her fated mate. He was engaged to another woman, and she was locked in his tower wearing stolen rags with no shoes and absolutely no plan. Her wolf whined low, aching for something she had no right to want. Morning came gray and thin through the narrow window. Sable had not slept. A guard appeared with a bowl of thin porridge and a summons. "The king will see you now." The throne room was empty this time. No courtiers, no candles, no music. Just the vast pale space and the king, standing by a window with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. Taryn stood near the door and gave her a barely perceptible nod. "Leave us," Acastus said without turning around. Taryn hesitated, then bowed and withdrew. The heavy doors closed behind him. They were alone. Sable stood 10 feet from the king and tried to keep her hands from trembling. His scent filled the empty hall, stronger without the crowd to dilute it, and her wolf clawed at the inside of her skin. He turned. The morning light caught his face, and she saw what the candlelight had hidden the night before. Exhaustion carved into every line, shadows beneath his amber eyes so deep they looked bruised. He looked at her, and she felt the bond pull so hard she swayed on her feet. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sable." "Sable what?" "Just Sable. I have no family name." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Where do you come from?" "Nowhere, Your Majesty. I was raised in the Thornfield poorhouse until I was 12. After that, I survived on my own." "You understand what happened last night?" he said. Not a question. "Yes." "And you understand that it changes nothing." The words landed like a closed fist. Sable held his gaze even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "You have a betrothed," she said. "A political alliance. I understand." "You will be given lodging in the lower keep," he said. "Food, clothing, a position in the palace herb stores if you are willing to work. In exchange, you will speak of what happened last night to no one. The bond will not be acknowledged publicly. Is that clear?" Sable swallowed. "And if the bond grows stronger?" His eyes flickered. For one unguarded second she saw it again. That raw, desperate thing he kept locked behind the mask. Then it was gone. "It will not," he said. "I will make sure of that." He turned back to the window. Dismissal. Absolute and final. Sable walked out of the throne room on bare feet. She made it to the corridor before her vision blurred. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall and forced herself to breathe through the ache blooming behind her ribs. He was going to marry someone else. He was going to pretend the bond did not exist, and she was supposed to accept that and quietly disappear into a basement storeroom. Her wolf howled, soundless and devastated. From inside the throne room, on the other side of the closed doors, she heard something shatter against stone. The herb stores were buried in the lowest level of the palace, a series of cool, vaulted rooms lined with shelves of dried plants, bottled tinctures, and clay jars sealed with wax. The air smelled of rosemary and dried sage and faintly of the earth itself. Mistress Calvara, the palace's head apothecary, was a stocky woman with iron-gray hair and a gaze that could curdle milk. She looked Sable up and down when Taryn deposited her at the door, sniffed once, and said, "You smell like a gutter." "I am aware," Sable replied. "Can you tell yarrow from hemlock?" "In the dark, by touch alone." Calvara's eyebrow rose a fraction. "Bold claim for a street rat." "I spent 6 years foraging to survive," Sable said. "I know every plant that grows within 40 leagues of this city, which ones heal, which ones kill, and which ones do both depending on the dose." Calvara studied her for a long, measuring moment. Then she jerked her chin toward the back room. "Wash." There are clothes in the chest by the basin. You start now. She threw herself into the work. Sorting, cataloging, grinding. Calvara tested her constantly, firing questions about dosages and the proper method for extracting oil from valerian root. Sable answered everyone correctly. By midday, Calvara had stopped testing and started assigning. It almost worked. The rhythm of labor, the focus required for precise measurements, the satisfaction of competence recognized. It almost drowned out the constant, maddening pull in her sternum. Almost. Because she could feel him. Not close, not nearby, but there. A persistent warmth at the edge of her senses, like a fire burning in a room she was not allowed to enter. She wondered if he could feel her too. By the third day, the ache had settled into something she could almost manage. She woke before dawn, worked until the light faded, and collapsed into her narrow cot in the small room beside the stores. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Sable was measuring dried foxglove into glass vials when the door opened and Taryn walked in, his expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately made her stomach drop. "The king requires a sleeping draught," Taryn said. "He has not slept in 4 days." Sable's hands stilled on the vials. 4 days. Her wolf pressed forward, anxious and whining. "There are court physicians for that," Calvara interjected from her workbench, not looking up. "The court physicians have tried," Taryn said. "Every preparation they have administered has failed." He paused. "Mistress Calvara, the king is requesting your personal expertise." Calvara set down her mortar and pestle with deliberate slowness. "Fine. I will prepare something and send it up." "The king has requested that the preparation be administered in person," Taryn said. She began gathering ingredients, muttering under her breath about kings who thought they knew better than healers. "Take this," Calvara said abruptly, pushing a sealed pouch across the counter toward Sable. "Bring it to the king's study. 3rd floor, east wing, last door on the left." Sable froze. "Me? I am not finished with the tincture itself. This is the base compound, passion flower and skullcap. He can brew it as a tea while he waits." "Go." The walk to the 3rd floor felt endless. Each step brought his scent closer, stronger, until by the time she stood outside the study door, it was so thick in the air she had to pause and press her hand against the wall to steady herself. She knocked. "Enter." The study was dim, lit only by a single lamp on the desk and the gray afternoon light struggling through rain-streaked windows. Papers and maps covered every surface. And behind the desk, Acastus sat with his head resting on one hand, his eyes shadowed and hollow. He looked worse than he had 4 days ago. The exhaustion had carved new hollows beneath his cheekbones, stripped away whatever reserves of composure he had been running on. He looked up when she entered. His entire body went still. "I was expecting Calvara," he said. "She sent the base compound ahead." Sable set the pouch on the desk, careful to keep distance between them. "Passion flower and skullcap. Brew it strong, steep for 10 minutes. He did not touch the pouch. He was staring at her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You look different," he said. "I bathed." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, not quite pain. He looked away first, breaking the connection, and she felt the severing like a physical snap behind her ribs. 4 days, she said, before she could stop herself. His gaze cut back to her, sharp. "What? You have not slept in 4 days. That is not your concern. Your hands are shaking." He looked down at his hands. She was right. A fine tremor ran through his fingers. He curled them into fists. "Leave the compound," he said. "Thank you." Sable turned to go. She made it 3 steps before she stopped, her hand on the door handle. "You cannot keep doing this," she said quietly, not turning around. "I beg your pardon?" "Fighting the bond." She turned now, meeting his eyes. "It is why you cannot sleep. You know that." The temperature in the room dropped. His expression hardened into something dangerous, the Alpha King surfacing behind the exhausted man. "You forget yourself?" he said. "Probably," Sable agreed. "But I am not wrong." The silence between them was a living, breathing thing. She could feel the bond straining, pulling them together with a force that made the air vibrate. His amber eyes held hers, and she watched the war play out across his face, the need fighting the duty, the wolf fighting the king. "The wedding is in 30 days, he said finally, his voice rough. "Lady Arena arrives at the palace in 1 week. Whatever this is, it cannot exist." Sable held his gaze for one more heartbeat. Then she nodded, turned, and walked out. She made it halfway down the corridor before her knees buckled. She caught herself against the wall, pressing her forehead to the cool stone, and felt tears burn behind her eyes that she absolutely refused to let fall. 30 days. That night, lying in her narrow cot, Sable felt him through the bond. Restless, awake, pacing his chambers above her like a caged animal. The sleeping draft had not worked. She knew it without being told. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, right where the ache lived, and closed her eyes. She could feel him reaching for her. Not consciously, not deliberately, but the way a drowning man reaches for the surface, blindly, desperately. Somewhere above her in the palace, the Alpha King stared at the ceiling of his chambers, his fists clenched in the sheets, and did not sleep. The king's insomnia became the palace's worst-kept secret within the week. Sable heard the whispers in the corridors, caught fragments drifting through the workroom when servants came for headache remedies and digestive tonics. The king had not slept in over a week. He had dismissed 2 court physicians. He had thrown a chair through a window in his study, and a glazier had been summoned at midnight to repair it before the court noticed. Calvara said nothing about any of it, but Sable caught her watching with that sharp, calculating gaze more than once. On the 8th day, Taryn appeared at the door again. "Mistress Calvara," he said, each word tight with urgency he was barely containing. "The king has requested Sable's presence." Both women went still. Calvara's hands paused mid-grind. Sable felt the blood drain from her face. "He requested me by name?" Sable asked. "He did." Calvara set down her pestle slowly. "Why?" Taryn's composure cracked for just a moment, and beneath it, Sable glimpsed genuine fear. "Because every remedy has failed, and he has not closed his eyes in 8 days, and I am watching my king fall apart. He believes proximity to Sable may help. He will not explain further." The Chancellor swallowed. "Please," he added. The walk to the king's private quarters felt like climbing toward a storm. Each step brought his scent closer, the warmth intensifying, pulling tighter, and by the time she stood outside his door, her hands were shaking. Taryn opened the door and stepped aside. The king's sitting room was dark. Heavy curtains had been drawn across every window. A single fire burned low in the grate. Maps and documents littered the floor around his desk, some crumpled, some torn. An overturned inkwell had bled a black stain across the carpet that no one had cleaned. Acastus sat in a chair by the fire, not at his desk, not working, just sitting, his elbows on his knees, his head hanging forward, his fingers laced behind his neck. He looked destroyed. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened into something grotesque. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look 10 years older. His hands were trembling visibly, even laced together. Sable's wolf keened with distress. "Your Majesty," she said softly. He lifted his head. His amber eyes found hers, and what she saw in them stole her breath. Every wall, every mask, every layer of authority had been burned away by 8 days without rest. What remained was raw and desperate and so utterly exhausted it made her ache. "I need to sleep," he said, The words came out hoarse, scraped thin. Nothing works. The bond is the reason, and you are the only remedy I have left. He swallowed, and the effort it took to say the next words was visible. Will you stay? Not a command this time. A request. The Alpha King, the man who had mocked her before his entire court, who had locked her in a tower, who had told her the bond could not exist, was asking for help. Yes, she said. Taryn arranged a narrow cot near the far wall of the king's bedchamber. The terms were clinical. She would sleep in the room. No contact. No conversation beyond what was necessary. She was a remedy, not a companion. Sable lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. The fire crackled. The room smelled overwhelmingly of him, cedar and iron soaked into every surface, and her wolf settled for the first time in 8 days, calming so completely that the sudden absence of restlessness felt like stepping out of a windstorm into still air. She heard his breathing change before she saw it. The controlled, rigid rhythm loosened, softened. His body sank deeper into the mattress, and the rustle of sheets stilled. 20 minutes. That was all it took. He was asleep. Sable lay listening to the deep, steady cadence of his breathing and felt something fragile and dangerous bloom inside her. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something quieter. Something that felt like belonging. She closed her eyes and slept better than she had in years. Morning light was thin and gray when Sable opened her eyes. The king was sitting on the edge of his bed, already dressed, watching her. She sat up quickly, heat rushing to her face. How long have you been awake? A while. He sounded different, clearer, steadier. The tremor was gone from his hands. You slept, she said. 7 hours. He said it like the words were foreign. That is good. It is unprecedented. A pause. Thank you. The gratitude was unguarded and genuine, and it hit her harder than any cruelty could have. You should know, he said, that Lady Orenna arrives in 3 days. The warmth inside her curdled. I am aware. This arrangement will need to remain entirely hidden from the court. From Orenna. From everyone. Sable nodded, keeping her expression neutral even as her wolf snarled. I understand. I am your sleeping draft. Nothing more. Something crossed his face at that. A flinch so quick she almost missed it. But he said nothing to correct her, and after a moment, she left his chambers. Sleeping draft. That was what she was. A remedy. A tool. Something to be used after dark and hidden in the daylight. She told herself it did not hurt. She was lying. And so, a rhythm formed. Each evening after the palace grew quiet, Sable slipped through the servants' corridors to the king's chambers. Each morning before dawn, she slipped back out. The arrangement was invisible, clinical, transactional. Except it was not. Because Acastus talked in his sleep. The first time it happened, she almost missed it. A murmur, half-formed, lost in the shifting of sheets. But the second night, she heard her name. Not a command, not a question. Just her name, breathed out like a prayer he did not know he was saying. Her heart cracked a little at the sound. By the 4th night, the distance between the cot and the bed felt like a canyon. Sable lay rigid, counting the stones in the ceiling, trying to ignore the magnetic pull that turned the 6 feet of empty floor between them into physical torment. He was awake too. She could hear it in his breathing, the same taut, restless awareness that refused to let either of them settle. You are not sleeping, she said. A long pause. Neither are you. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Tell me something, he said, about yourself. Anything. It caught her off guard. She turned her head toward him, though she could barely make out his shape. I used to sleep in the hollow of an old elm tree near the river crossing south of Thornfield, she said. The trunk was split by lightning, and the inside was dry and warm. I lined it with moss and stolen wool. It was the safest place I have ever known. The silence that followed was different, softer. "You were a child," he said, "sleeping in a tree." "I was 12. He did not respond for a long time. When he spoke again, something had changed in the way he spoke. Lower. Rougher. "You should not have had to survive like that." "People survive however they can, Your Majesty." "Acastus," he said. Sable blinked. "What?" "My name. When we are alone. If you are going to sleep in my room, you can at least use my name." The quiet permission settled over her like a warm hand on cold skin. "Acastus," she said, testing the shape of it. She heard him exhale, long and slow, like something inside him had finally loosened. They both fell asleep within minutes. Lady Orenna of House Veilcrest arrived at the palace on a morning of bright, merciless sunshine, and she was everything Sable was not. Sable watched from the workroom window, 3 floors below and a world apart, as the procession entered the courtyard. White horses, gilded carriages, an entourage of 40, all dressed in the deep emerald and silver of House Veilcrest. And at the center of it all, Orenna herself. She was tall and elegant, with auburn hair swept into an elaborate arrangement that caught the light like polished copper. Her dress was ivory silk, cut to emphasize a figure that drew every eye in the courtyard. She moved with the fluid confidence of a woman who had been raised to stand beside a king. When Acastus stepped forward to greet her, Sable watched his face. She searched for reluctance, for hesitation, for any sign of the man who murmured her name in his sleep. He smiled at Orenna. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips with practiced grace. He looked every inch the pleased bridegroom. Sable turned away from the window. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the workbench and breathed through the jealousy that tore through her like claws. She had no right to this feeling. He was not hers. He had never been hers. She was his sleeping draft, and sleeping drafts did not get jealous. Calvara appeared beside her, set a cup of tea on the bench, and said nothing. Which was its own kind of kindness. That evening, Sable arrived at the king's chambers at the usual hour and found Teren waiting outside the door. "Lady Orenna is dining with the king tonight," the chancellor said. His tone was apologetic but firm. "It would be best if you stayed away." Sable nodded. Her face betrayed nothing. "Of course." She turned and walked back down the corridor, her footsteps steady, her spine straight, and made it all the way to the stockroom before the first sob escaped her throat. She clamped her hand over her mouth and sank to the floor beside the workbench and let the grief come in silent, shuddering waves. It was absurd. She was crying over a man she could not have, a bond he refused to acknowledge, a future that had never been offered to her. But the bond cared nothing for logic. It only knew that she should be beside him, and she was not, and someone else was. She slept in her narrow cot that night, alone. The pull was a constant, grinding ache that made every breath feel like inhaling through bruised ribs. She barely slept. Neither did he. She felt it through the bond, the restless turning, the frustrated wakefulness, the long hours of nothing. With Orenna near him and Sable absent, the insomnia returned with vengeance. The next morning, Teren appeared with shadows under his own eyes. "He did not sleep at all," the chancellor said flatly. "He was up pacing until dawn." Lady Orenna heard him through the walls and asked if he was ill. Sable said nothing. She measured dried chamomile into a jar with steady, mechanical movements and waited for the instruction she already knew was coming. "Tonight," Teren said, discreetly. And so began the cruelest arrangement Sable had ever endured. During the day, King Acastus courted Lady Orenna. He walked with her in the gardens. He sat beside her at meals. He introduced her to the court with warmth. and the palace buzzed with approval of the match. Orenna was gracious, intelligent, politically astute. She was exactly the queen the realm needed. During the night, Sable slept on a cot in his chambers, 6 feet from his bed, feeling him settle into sleep only because she was near, and left before dawn so no one would ever know. She existed in the margins of his life, the secret, the shadow, the unnamed thing that kept him alive but could never be spoken aloud. It was destroying her. The bond grew stronger with every night spent in proximity. She could feel his emotions at unexpected moments during the day. A spike of frustration during a council meeting. A flicker of warmth when Orenna said something clever. And beneath it all, the constant buried ache that mirrored her own, the one he would not name, the one that tasted like longing. On the 5th night after Orenna's arrival, something shifted. Sable lay on the cot, listening to the fire. Acastus was still awake. She could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing, too controlled to be sleep. "She is a good woman," he said suddenly. Sable's throat tightened. "I am sure she is. She is kind and intelligent, and she will make a strong queen. The alliance will protect the northern settlements for a generation." "Then you are fortunate." A long silence. "I am trying to do the right thing," he said, and the last word came out broken. Sable closed her eyes. The tears came silently, sliding sideways across her temples and into her hair. She heard the mattress shift, heard him sit up, heard his bare feet on the stone floor, and then he was standing beside her cot, looking down at her in the faint ember light. "You are crying," he said. His voice was raw. "No, I am not." He knelt beside the cot. She felt his hand hover near her face, the warmth of his fingers inches from her cheek, trembling with the effort of not touching her. "Sable," he whispered. Her name in his mouth undid her completely. A sob broke free, and she turned her face into the pillow to muffle it. His hand found her hair, just her hair. His fingers threaded through it gently, carefully, like she was something precious. And the tenderness of it was worse than any cruelty because it told her everything his words refused to say. "I am sorry," he breathed. "I am so sorry." She reached up and caught his hand, pressing it against her cheek. His palm was rough and warm and shaking, and the contact sent a shock through the bond so intense that they both gasped. For one moment, just one, he let himself lean into it. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and she felt his breath on her lips, uneven and desperate. His wolf was right there, pressing against hers, and the recognition was overwhelming, absolute, undeniable. Then he pulled away. He stood, stepped back, and returned to his bed without a word. Neither of them slept that night. The wedding preparations consumed the palace like a fever. Seamstresses filled the east wing with bolts of white silk and ivory lace. Florists arrived with cartloads of winter roses. The kitchens operated around the clock, testing menus and baking sample cakes that nobody in the apothecary was invited to taste. Calvara cornered her on the 12th morning. The old apothecary blocked the door, crossed her arms, and fixed Sable with a stare that allowed no evasion. "You are fading," Calvara said. "I am fine. You have lost weight. Your hands are unsteady. You miscounted the foxglove dose twice yesterday, and you never miscounted once in your first 3 weeks here." Calvara's eyes narrowed. "I know what you are. I have known since the rite." Sable's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "You are his mate. I have been an apothecary for 37 years. I know what a mate bond looks like when it is being denied. You smell like him, and he smells like you, and neither of you can hide it from anyone with a trained nose." Calvara's expression softened by a single, almost imperceptible degree. "The bond is incomplete. The longer it stays that way, the worse the symptoms become. For both of you." Sable leaned against the doorframe. There is nothing to be done about it. He is marrying Lady Orenna. And you are content to waste away in my stockroom while the man you are bonded to marries a stranger? She is not a stranger to him. She is not his mate, either. Sable shook her head. He has a duty to his kingdom. I will not be the reason a border alliance collapses. Calvara studied her for a long moment. Stubborn child, she muttered. Just like him. 14 days before the wedding, Sable stopped sleeping in the king's chambers. She did not announce it. She simply stopped going. She lay on her cot and felt the bond stretch thin and screaming between them, and she endured it because the alternative was watching him marry someone else while still smelling like his sheets. The first night, the ache was manageable. A deep, grinding pressure in her sternum that made breathing uncomfortable, but not impossible. The second night, the pressure became pain. A fist of iron squeezing her ribs, tightening with every hour that passed without his proximity. By the third night, her vision was blurring at the edges. Her hands trembled so badly she could not hold a measuring spoon. Her wolf had gone silent, withdrawn deep inside her, curling in on itself like a wounded animal. On the fourth morning, Taryn found her on the floor of the stockroom. She had collapsed some time before dawn. She only knew she was on the cold stone, her cheek pressed against the ground, her body too heavy to move. Sable. Taryn's voice came from far away. Hands lifted her, gentle but urgent. Sable, can you hear me? She was carried. She felt the sway of movement, felt corridors pass around her in a blur of gray stone and candlelight. She was placed on something soft, a bed. Not her cot. Something wider, warmer, that smelled so powerfully of cedar and iron that her wolf stirred from its silence and pressed forward with a broken, desperate whine. His bed. She was in his bed. What happened? Acastus's voice, sharp as a blade and vibrating with something she had never heard from him before. Fear. Real, undisguised fear. She collapsed, Taryn said. She has not been coming to your chambers. 4 nights. A sound escaped the king that was not human. A snarl, low and anguished, that reverberated through the room and made the windows rattle. Why? He demanded. You would have to ask her that, Your Majesty. Sable felt a hand on her face, rough and warm and shaking. His thumb traced her cheekbone, her jaw, the hollow beneath her eye. She managed to open her eyes halfway. Acastus was leaning over her, and his face was wrecked. Not controlled exhaustion, devastation. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, his jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped beneath the skin. Why did you stop coming? He asked, barely above a whisper. She was too tired to lie, too tired to protect herself. Because I cannot keep sleeping beside you and pretending I do not love you, she said. It is killing me slower than the distance, but at least the distance is honest. The sound he made was inhuman. He pressed his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face, and she felt his tears fall onto her skin. You are killing yourself, he said, the words barely holding together. An incomplete mate bond that is actively resisted can be fatal. Do you understand? You could die. So could you, she whispered. I do not care about me. Well, I do. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and his expression was so open, so completely undefended that she could see straight through every wall he had ever built. I cannot marry her, he said. The words came out like they had been dragged from him by force, like they had been clawing at the inside of his throat for weeks, and he had finally lost the strength to hold them back. I have been trying, but I cannot marry her because every cell in my body knows that you are mine, and I am yours, and this bond will not be reasoned with, or negotiated with, or ignored. Sable's tears spilled over. What about the alliance? The northern border? I will find another way. I will offer Veilcrest whatever they want. Land, trade concessions, military support. But I am not marrying a woman who is not my mate while my actual mate starves herself to death in my basement. A broken laugh escaped her throat. That is a very dramatic way to describe the stockroom. He almost smiled. His thumb brushed the tears from her cheek. Stay, he said. Please. Stay, and let me fix this. And Orenna? The guilt that crossed his face was real and heavy. She deserves honesty. She will have it. Tomorrow. Sable searched his eyes for doubt and found none. Stay, he said again, softer, and the word sounded like it meant everything. I will stay, Sable whispered. His arms gathered her against his chest, and she felt his entire body shudder with relief. The bond flared between them, warm and golden and aching, and for the first time since the throne room, it did not hurt. She pressed her ear against his heartbeat, closed her eyes, and fell asleep in seconds. He followed her under within minutes, his arms locked around her, his breathing deep and even for the first time in days. Neither of them dreamed. Sable woke to voices. Not in the room. Beyond the door. Low and tense, the kind of conversation held in corridors when people believed no one else was listening. She recognized Taryn's measured cadence first, then a second voice. Female, clipped and cold with the particular fury of someone exercising extreme control. How long? The woman's voice demanded. My lady, the king will explain everything this morning. If you would allow me to escort you to the... How long has she been in his bed, Chancellor? Silence. Sable sat up. The sheet still carried the warmth of Acastus's body, but the space beside her was empty. He was gone. The fire had burned to ash, and the morning light through the curtains was harsh and white. The door opened. Lady Orenna stood on the threshold. She was immaculate, dressed in pale green silk, her auburn hair arranged with precision, her posture as straight and composed as a drawn sword. Behind her, Taryn hovered with the expression of a man watching something catch fire and having no water. Orenna's gaze moved slowly across the room. It found the rumpled bed. It found Sable sitting in it, wearing a borrowed nightgown, her hair loose and tangled, the evidence of everything Acastus had promised to explain, written across the scene in terms that required no translation. So, Orenna said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were not. The rumors were true. My lady, this is not what... Sable started. Do not. Orenna held up a hand, one sharp gesture that cut the air between them. Do not insult me by pretending this is something innocent. I can smell him on you from the doorway. Sable closed her mouth. Orenna was right. There was no lie that would hold, and she would not dishonor this woman with one. Where is he? Orenna asked Taryn without looking at him. The council chamber. He is waiting to speak with you privately, my lady. Orenna's jaw tightened. Her gaze returned to Sable, and for a moment the mask slipped. Beneath the composure, beneath the breeding and the dignity, there was hurt. Real and raw and undeserved. Are you his mate? Orenna asked quietly. The question landed like a stone in still water. Sable met her eyes. Yes. Orenna's breath hitched. Just once, a single crack in the armor, there and gone. Then she straightened, turned on her heel, and walked out. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured and deliberate, the sound of a woman who would not allow herself to break where anyone could see. Sable dressed with numb hands. She found Acastus in a small antechamber off the council room, alone, standing at the window with his forehead resting against the glass. His fists were braced against the sill, and his shoulders were rigid. She knows, Sable said from the door. She came to your room before Taryn could stop her. He did not turn around. I was too late. What happens now? I spoke with her. The words came out rough, scraped raw. I told her everything. The bond, the insomnia, The fact that I have been lying to her since she set foot in this palace. She listened to all of it without interrupting. He paused. Then she asked me a single question. What question? He turned from the window. His amber eyes were bloodshot, heavy with guilt, but beneath it there was something resolute. She asked if I would have married her if the bond had never formed. If you had never walked into that throne room. Sable's breath caught. What did you say? I told her yes. I told her I would have married her and served the alliance faithfully and never known what I was missing. He swallowed hard. And she said that was exactly why she could not marry me, because she deserved a husband who chose her, not one who settled for her in ignorance. The grief was real, not for a lost romance, but for a good woman wronged by circumstances he had created. She is leaving today, he continued. She has requested a revised alliance, trade and military terms without the marriage. She should not have had to be so generous, Sable said quietly. No. He met her eyes. She should not. They stood together in the silence. Sable reached for his hand. He took it, and she felt the bond pulse between them, steady and warm, alive with something that had survived every attempt to smother it. The court will not accept me, Sable said. The court does not choose my mate. I have no name, no house, no bloodline. I was a beggar in rags 2 weeks ago. And you are the only person in this kingdom who can bring me peace. He raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles. Let them talk. Let them object. I will answer every challenge, but I will not deny this bond for one more day. Sable felt the tears rise, but she held them. She had cried enough in dark rooms. This moment deserved something different. Then do not deny it, she said. His mouth found hers, and the kiss was not desperate this time. It was slow and deliberate and sure. A declaration made in a small room with no audience, just 2 people choosing each other with full knowledge of the cost. The bond blazed between them, golden and fierce, and something that had been fractured from the very first night finally locked into place. From the courtyard below, the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone. Orenna was leaving, and everything was about to change. The court's reaction was exactly as brutal as Sable had expected. The announcement came 3 days after Orenna's departure. Acastus stood before his full council, his lords, his generals, and the assembled nobility, and declared that the royal betrothal was dissolved, that a fated mate bond had been identified, that the woman in question was an omega of no house and no title, a foundling raised in a poorhouse, and that she would be recognized as his queen. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then the hall erupted. Sable stood beside Taryn at the edge of the room and watched it unfold. The outrage, the disbelief, the barely concealed disgust on faces that had never once looked in her direction before and were now staring at her like she was a disease that had infected their king. Lord Dravain was the first to speak. A heavy-set man with a silver beard and the permanent expression of someone smelling something foul, he rose from his seat and addressed the king with the tone of a man correcting a wayward child. Your Majesty, with respect, this is unprecedented. A foundling Omega with no verified bloodline cannot sit on the throne of Valandor. The law requires a fated bond to supersede all prior arrangements, Acastus interrupted, his voice cold and level. Section 14 of the Sovereign Charter, written by my great-grandfather. I suggest you read it before you lecture me on my own laws, Lord Dravain. Dravain's mouth opened and closed. He sat down. Others rose. Arguments were made, some measured, some furious, some laced with thinly veiled contempt for Sable herself. She stood through all of it, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin level, her expression neutral. Inside, her wolf was howling. That night, in his chambers, the composure finally cracked. Sable sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands while the echoes of every insult replayed behind her eyes. "They called me a gutter rat," she said quietly, to my face, in front of the entire court. Acastus knelt in front of her, his hands covering hers. "They are afraid of change. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. I am the change they are afraid of." She looked at him, and the old wound, the one she had carried since infancy, the one that whispered, "You are not enough. You are not wanted. You do not belong," throbbed with a fresh and terrible ache. What if they are right? They are not. You do not know that. I have no parents, no history, no name beyond the one the poorhouse gave me. Her voice cracked. What if I am exactly what they say I am? What if I am nothing? Acastus lifted her chin with his finger, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are the woman who survived alone in the wild from the age of 12, who taught herself to heal, who walked into a throne room full of wolves who would have torn her apart and did not flinch, who chose to help a man who had mocked her, imprisoned her, and denied her." His voice was low and fierce and shaking with conviction. "You are not nothing. You have never been nothing." The tears came then, hot and silent, and she let them fall because she was so tired of holding them back. He gathered her into his arms and held her, and she felt his fury at every person who had made her feel small, and his grief that he had been one of them. "I called you a stray," he said against her hair, and the words came out rough with shame. "In front of the entire court, the first words I ever spoke about you were designed to humiliate you, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. You did not know. That does not excuse it." He pulled back to look at her. "I saw you standing there, barefoot and starving, and my first instinct was cruelty, because I was afraid of what the bond meant, because it was easier to mock you than to admit that my entire world had just shifted." His jaw clenched. "I am sorry, Sable. I am sorry for every moment you spent in that tower, every night you slept on that cot, every time I pretended you were invisible." She cupped his face in her hands. "You are making up for it now. I will spend the rest of my life making up for it." She kissed him. It was soft and slow and tasted like salt from her tears, and when he kissed her back, she felt the bond flare so bright it was almost blinding. The warmth of it spread through her limbs, her bones, filling every hollow space that had been empty for as long as she could remember. He held her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life, and she held on to him like he was the first solid ground she had ever stood on. The bond between them deepened, not all at once, but in a rush of warmth and recognition, two wolves finally acknowledging what they had known from the very first moment in that throne room. It settled into place with a quiet finality that resonated through every cell. She was no longer alone. She would never be alone again. They lay tangled together afterward, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. The fire had burned low, casting the room in deep amber. "What if I never find out who my parents were?" she murmured. "What if there is no great secret, no lost noble bloodline? What if I really am just a girl who was left on some steps?" Acastus pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Then you are a girl who was left on some steps who became the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. And I do not need you to be anything other than exactly who you are." Sable closed her eyes and let the words settle into the place where the old wound lived. They did not heal it. Nothing would heal it entirely, but they made it quieter, smaller, less sharp. She slept deeply that night, dreamless and warm, wrapped in the arms of the man who had once called her a stray and now held her like she was the most precious thing in his world. The coronation was held on the first day of spring, Sable stood in the great hall in a gown of deep midnight blue, not white, because she had refused to wear the color of a woman she still felt she owed a debt. The court watched in silence as Acastus placed the crown on her head, a simple circlet of silver and sapphire that caught the light like captured starlight. She had expected hostility. There was some. Lord Dravain's expression could have curdled stone. But there were other faces too, younger lords and ladies who looked at her with something closer to curiosity than contempt, and servants along the walls who watched with quiet, unmistakable pride. Calvara stood near the back, arms crossed, and when Sable caught her eye, the old apothecary gave a single nod. It was the highest compliment she had ever received from the woman. Taren, standing at his usual post 1 step behind the throne, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The months that followed were not easy. The court did not transform overnight. There were challenges, formal objections, whispered campaigns to undermine her. Sable met each one with the same stubborn, quiet resolve that had kept her alive in hollow trees and frozen alleyways. She kept her work in the apothecary. Not every day, not with the same hours, but enough to stay grounded, enough to remember who she was beneath the crown. Calvara never treated her differently, which was exactly what Sable needed. Acastus slept through the night now. Every night. The insomnia that had nearly killed him was a memory, replaced by the deep, steady rest of a man whose wolf was finally at peace. On a warm evening in late spring, Sable sat on the wide windowsill of their chambers, watching the sun set over the city. Acastus came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "The Veilcrest Treaty was ratified today," he said. "Full trade and military alliance. No marriage required." Sable leaned back against his chest. "And Orenna?" "Engaged. To a lord from the coastal provinces. By choice, apparently. She sounds happy." Sable smiled. The relief was genuine and deep. They stayed like that as the light faded, his arms around her, her back against his chest, the bond humming between them like a low, steady song. No fear, no secrets, no cots on the far side of the room, just warmth, just peace, just the quiet, hard-won certainty that they belonged exactly where they were. Outside, the first stars appeared, and the kingdom settled into evening, and the Alpha King held his mate and did not let go. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.